The Grand Alpine. Why every mirror in this abandoned hotel is covered with heavy iron chains. The first thing you notice when you step through the shattered front doors of the Grand Alpine is not the darkness. It is not the smell of mold pressing against your face like a wet hand. It is not even the cold, which hits you in January like something alive and deliberate. It is the chains. Heavy. Industrial. Bolted directly into the masonry with iron anchors the size of a man's fist. They cross every mirror in the lobby in an X pattern, pulled taut against the glass like the hotel itself is holding its breath. The rust on them is deep and layered, the kind that takes decades to accumulate, the kind that tells you these chains were not placed here as decoration or afterthought. They were placed here by people who were afraid. The Grand Alpine sits at 2,800 meters above sea level in the Austrian Alps, and in 2026, it has been abandoned for exactly 41 years. Urban explorers who have attempted to document the interior in recent years have reported something unusual before they even reach the tree-line. Their phones lose signal, their compasses spin without settling, and their battery-powered torches flicker in a rhythm that several independent visitors have described, without comparing notes, as a heartbeat. The Austrian Heritage Commission listed the building for potential demolition in 2019. The demolition has not happened. The contractors who came to assess the structure left on the same day they arrived. None of them have spoken publicly about why. What we know about the Grand Alpine comes from three sources: the original architectural blueprints held in a Vienna archive, a collection of personal journals recovered from the hotel manager's office in 1987, and a series of digital audio recordings uploaded anonymously to an exploration forum between 2018 and 2024, after which the forum was quietly taken down. When you piece these sources together, a picture emerges that is not about architecture. It is not about history. It is about glass, and what happens when the thing looking back at you from inside the glass decides it no longer wants to follow your lead. The Grand Alpine was built between 1907 and 1912 by a Viennese industrialist named Edmund Krasser, whose fortune came from mirror manufacturing. This is the first detail that matters. Krasser did not simply commission the hotel. He designed the mirror installation himself, specifying in the original blueprints a mercury content in the glass backing that was 3 times the legal standard of the time. His notation in the margin of the blueprint reads, in German, "The barrier must be thick enough to hold weight from both sides." For the first decade of the hotel's operation, no one thought much about this. The mirrors were beautiful. They were enormous, floor-to-ceiling installations in the lobby, the dining hall, the ballroom, the corridors, and every one of the 47 guest rooms. Guests remarked on how flattering they were, how the glass seemed to have a depth that ordinary mirrors lacked, a quality of luminosity that made the rooms feel larger than they were. The Grand Alpine became one of the most fashionable winter resorts in Central Europe. Kings stayed here. Composers stayed here. In 1914, a minor Habsburg archduke celebrated his birthday in the ballroom, and photographs from that evening show the mirrors reflecting the chandeliers in a way that made the room look like it extended infinitely in every direction. Then the war came, and the hotel closed, and Edmund Krasser died in 1917 of an illness his physicians could not name. His personal journals, written in the last 8 months of his life, are the second source we have. They are held now in a private collection in Salzburg, and the portions relevant to the Grand Alpine make for difficult reading. Not because they are written badly. Krasser was an educated man with a precise and clinical style. They make for difficult reading because of what he describes with that precision. He began noticing it in his own home first, in the mirrors he had made for himself using the same formula as the Grand Alpine glass. He writes that in the autumn of 1916, he caught his reflection performing a gesture he had not made. He had been standing still, both hands at his sides, looking at himself in the dressing room mirror. His reflection raised its right hand and touched its own face. Krasser's hand did not move. He writes that he stood there for 11 minutes waiting for the reflection to correct itself. It did not. Eventually, the reflection lowered its hand and resumed mimicking him normally, as if nothing had happened. He tells himself, in the journal, that it was a trick of exhaustion. He had not been sleeping well. There were other explanations. There were always other explanations. But then it happened again. and again. And he began to notice that the lag between his movements and his reflection's movements was growing, incrementally, week by week, like something on the other side of the glass was taking longer and longer to pay attention to him, becoming more interested in doing its own things. By the time he writes the final entries, the lag in his home mirrors has stretched to 3 full seconds. He describes walking past a mirror and seeing his reflection continue walking for 3 seconds after he has stopped. He describes turning his head and watching the face in the glass finish turning a moment later, but not quite all the way, stopping at a slightly different angle, looking at something in the reflected room that does not exist in the real room. And he describes the faces beginning to change. Not dramatically, not grotesquely, not at first. Small things. The reflection's eyes sitting fractionally wider than his own. The set of the mouth slightly different, not smiling exactly, but with an arrangement of muscles that suggested something other than neutrality. He writes, "It is beginning to have expressions that are its own. It looks at me with what I can only describe as appetite." He died before he could return to the Grand Alpine. But in his final journal entry, dated 3 weeks before his death, he wrote a single instruction. The glass at the Alpine must be bound with iron. Not wood. Not rope. Iron. The reflections there have had longer to grow, and they are further along than mine. If the glass is not restrained, they will eventually find the threshold. Nobody acted on Krasser's instruction during the war. The hotel sat empty, and whatever was developing inside the mirrors developed undisturbed. When the Grand Alpine reopened in 1921 under new management, the new owner, a Swiss hotelier named Franz Bauer, hired a cleaning staff to prepare the building. 3 of those staff members quit on the first day. Their letters of resignation, preserved in the hotel's administrative files, give different reasons: personal circumstances, a family matter, a better offer elsewhere. But one of the 3, a woman named Hilda Maurer, wrote a letter to her sister that was recovered with the administrative files, apparently filed accidentally, with the wrong documents. In the letter, she tells her sister that she cannot go back to the Alpine because of what she saw in the ballroom mirrors. She had been cleaning the ballroom floor. She was alone. She stood up from her work and looked at her reflection in the large mirror on the far wall, and the reflection was not looking back at her. It was looking to the left, at something in the ballroom that was not there. She turned to look. There was nothing. When she turned back, the reflection had resumed looking at her, but its expression was wrong. She writes, and she does not elaborate on how it was wrong, only that she knew immediately that what was looking at her through the glass was not her, and that it was aware of her, and that it did not want her to leave. She left anyway. She never returned. Franz Bauer, who had no knowledge of Krasser's journals, dismissed the reports as superstition. He reopened the hotel. Guests came. For a while it was fine. The first documented incident with a guest occurred in the winter of 1923. A wealthy Czech businessman named Antonin Havel checked into room 14 for a 2-week stay and checked out after 4 days. His checkout note to the management, which survived in the files, says only, "The mirror in my room is broken. I cannot stay in a room with a broken mirror." The mirror in room 14 was inspected the next morning and found to be physically undamaged. But the staff member who conducted the inspection, a young man named Georg, left a handwritten note of his own clipped to the inspection report. It says, "Mirror intact. However, I do not think it should be left uncovered. I do not want to say more than this." Georg would later become the hotel's head of maintenance. He stayed at the Grand Alpine for 30 years. And in 1929, after consulting with 2 occultists from Vienna whose identities remain unknown, he personally supervised the installation of the iron chains. The blueprints for the chain installation are in the Vienna archive alongside Krasser's original building plans. Georg drew them himself, in meticulous detail. Each chain was to be made from a specific iron alloy, one with a high carbon content, which the occultists had specified mattered. The chains were to be anchored in the masonry on both sides of each mirror, pulled to a particular tension that Georg measured using a device he built himself and described in a separate document. The tension was not about preventing the glass from falling. The mirrors were already bolted to the walls. The tension was, according to Georg's notes, to create resistance that the threshold cannot overcome from the inside. He believed, based on what the Viennese occultists had told him and what he had observed himself over 8 years at the Alpine, that the mirrors were not malfunctioning. They were functioning exactly as Krasser had designed them. The excess mercury in the glass had done what Krasser, in some private corner of his ambition, had perhaps intended. It had thickened the membrane between spaces, created a glass that was less a reflective surface and more a permeable boundary. And the things that had been pressed up against that boundary for years, learning the shapes and movements of the people they observed, were becoming substantial. They were accumulating definition. They were developing, to use the word Georg uses in his notes, insistence. The chains went up in the spring of 1929. The incident stopped. The hotel ran without major disruption for another 50 years. But iron rusts. This is the thing that nobody who installed those chains could fully account for. They were building a containment system meant to last indefinitely, using a material that time destroys. Georg knew this. His maintenance logs show that he inspected the chains quarterly and replaced individual links when he found significant corrosion. But Georg retired in 1961 and died in 1963, and nobody who came after him understood what the chains were for. The new maintenance staff saw rusted iron over old mirrors and assumed it was some decorative affectation from an earlier era, or perhaps a safety measure to prevent the large mirrors from swinging away from the wall. They oiled the chains occasionally. They replaced links that looked structurally dangerous. But they did not maintain them with Georg's precision or Georg's understanding. By 1985, when the Grand Alpine closed for the last time, the chains were in significantly worse condition than they had been in 1929. And the mirrors behind them were in significantly worse condition too. The silver nitrate backing, already unusual in its composition due to the mercury content, had begun to decay in a way that mirror conservators who examined photographs of the interior have found difficult to categorize. The decay does not look like normal silvering deterioration, which produces black spots and cloudy patches in predictable patterns. The decay in the Alpine mirrors, visible in photographs taken by the last staff and by explorers who entered in the 1990s, appears to move. Dark shapes within the backing shift between photographs taken hours apart. In several photographs, the shapes resolve, when you look at them long enough, into something that has a posture and a face, and is pressed close to the glass from the inside. The audio recordings appeared online between 2018 and 2024, uploaded by explorers who had entered the Alpine and come back out with something on their recorders they could not explain. There were 11 recordings in total before the forum was removed. The people who made them have not been publicly identified. In the first recording, a man and a woman are walking through the lobby. You can hear their footsteps on marble, their breathing, the creak of the building. The woman says, quietly, "My reflection just waved at me." The man says, "What?" The woman says, "It waved." "I didn't wave. My reflection waved." There is a long silence. Then the man says, "Mine is facing the wrong way." The recording ends. In the fourth recording, a solo explorer is documenting the dining hall. He is describing the chains methodically, measuring their rust with what sounds like a pocket knife, tapping links, and listening to the tone. He stops mid-sentence and says, very quietly, "Oh, it's looking at me." Nothing else. The recording runs for another 20 minutes of silence before it stops. In the ninth recording, a group of 3 people enters the ballroom. One of them, a woman, begins to laugh, the kind of laugh that is not about something funny. She says, "It has my face, but it doesn't have my eyes. It has my face, but it doesn't have my eyes." She repeats this 4 times, her voice getting quieter each time. Her companions are trying to get her to move. Eventually they do. In the background, as they are leaving, you can hear something else. A sound from inside the mirror. A sound like glass being struck, slowly and rhythmically from the inside. The 11th recording is the one most people who heard them found most disturbing, not because of what is heard, but because of what is not heard. A single explorer enters the hotel, documents the lobby briefly, then goes quiet. For 37 minutes, the recording captures only the sounds of the building, wind in the upper floors, the creak of settling timber, the distant sound of snow on the roof. And then, at the 38th minute, a voice. Not the explorer's voice. A voice that comes from somewhere in the room, but does not have a body as its source. A voice that sounds like the explorer's voice, but with a quality that people who have analyzed the recording describe variously as hollow or layered, or as if it is coming from the other side of something. The voice says, in the explorer's own accent and cadence, "He already left. I'm still here." The recording ends. The explorer, who made that recording, has not been heard from since uploading it. In 2024, a structural engineer named Miriam Scholl, hired by the Heritage Commission to produce a final assessment before a new demolition vote, spent 4 hours inside the Grand Alpine. She brought no audio equipment. She wore no camera. She has given one interview about what she found to an Austrian regional newspaper, and the interview was brief and technical in its language, but one passage stands out. She describes reaching the penthouse suite on the 7th floor, which contains the largest mirror in the hotel, a 6-meter installation that runs the full width of the suite's main room. The chains on this mirror are the heaviest in the building, doubled up in some sections, the anchors the size of a man's head. Scholl spent time measuring the tension on the chains using her instruments. She found that several links on the lower left section of the mirror were at approximately 60% of their original structural integrity. She found microscopic fractures in the glass itself, in a pattern she describes as radial, originating from a central point, consistent with repeated impact from a single source. The fractures originated from behind the glass. She writes in her report, in language as dry and professional as she can manage, "The glass in the penthouse suite shows impact fracturing from the reverse side. The pattern and depth of fracturing suggests repeated force applied over an extended period. The source of this force is not consistent with thermal expansion, seismic activity, or structural settlement. I have no further comment on the origin of the force." In the newspaper interview, the journalist asked her one final question. When she was in the penthouse suite, measuring the chains, did her reflection behave normally? Scholl was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't look at it directly. I made sure not to look at it directly. But in my peripheral vision, before I was careful enough to keep my peripheral vision away from the glass as well." She stopped. She said, "The reflection was not standing where I was standing. It was standing at the mirror. It was very close to the glass. And it was watching me work." She recommended immediate demolition. The Heritage Commission has not yet voted. The chains are still there. All of them. And in the deep winter of 2026, when the snow on the Alpine roof is heavy enough to groan the old beams, when the temperature inside the building drops below the point where breath becomes visible, the mirrors behind those chains are doing what they've been doing since Edmund Krasser's mercury-thick glass first gave them enough depth to develop in. They are waiting. They have learned patience. They have had a century to learn it. They have watched thousands of faces come and go, studied the way humans carry themselves, learned to replicate every gesture, every expression, every habit of movement. They are very good at looking like us now. If you stood in front of one of those mirrors and watched carefully, you might not even notice the 3-second lag anymore. They have learned to compensate, to predict, to move in near-perfect synchrony with whatever living person stands before them. Nearly perfect, not quite. And the chains are old, and the links have rust in them down to their cores. And in the lower left section of the penthouse mirror, the fractures in the glass spread a fraction of a millimeter further every winter, growing outward from that central point of impact, that single place where something has been pressing steadily, patiently, for longer than most of the people reading this have been alive. One link. That is the current margin. By Scholl's calculations, the structural failure of one link in that lower left section would reduce the tension on the glass enough to compromise what Georg called the threshold. And the thing in the penthouse mirror, the one that has Krasser's face now because Krasser's was the first face it learned, the one that stands at the glass and watches and waits with an expression that is almost patience but is actually something that doesn't have a human name, it knows about the link. It has always known. It is not in a hurry. It has nowhere else to be. The Grand Alpine Heritage Commission vote is scheduled for March 2026. The demolition, if approved, would require contractors to enter the building and remove the mirrors before the structure is raised. No contractor has yet agreed to take the job. The commission is still looking.